Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Inside the Margin. My name is Bryce Cracknell, and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of The Margin. I really appreciate y'all joining us tonight. At The Margin, we produce investigative, data-driven, and deeply human journalism that centers the experiences of frontline communities. Inside the Margin is our opportunity to continue these stories beyond publication by bringing people together whose lived experience and expertise shaped our reporting. Tonight's conversation is centered on our latest feature, Kentucky's Ashen Promises. As federal oversight softens, aging Kentucky coal plants stay online, feeding data center demand at the expense of nearby communities. The story specifically examines the long-term environmental and public health impacts of coal ash contamination on the Mill Creek generating station in Louisville, Kentucky. Tonight, we'll talk about what's happening beneath the surface, what we know about the potential health impacts of coal ash exposure, and we'll also talk about energy and data centers, and we'll discuss what accountability looks like. Now, before we begin, I want to offer a brief content note. Some of tonight's conversation may touch on serious health concerns, environmental exposure, and cancer. We'll approach these topics with care and respect for what people at the center of the reporting are experiencing. I am joined tonight by three incredible guests. Austyn Gaffney, who is a freelance writer and reporter who reports largely on climate and energy. Her work can be found in The Atlantic, The Guardian, National Geographic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and now The Margin. She was born in Canada and raised in Kentucky, where she's calling in today. We also have Tom FitzGerald. Fitz is the served as director of Kentucky Resources Council from 1984 until October 1st, 2021. He is now of council, and Fitz is also an adjunct professor of energy and environmental law at Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. He has received numerous awards, including the Environmental Quality Commission Lifetime Achievement Award and the 14th Heinz Award in the environmental category. Fitz was a fixture in the halls of the Kentucky General Assembly from 1978 through to 2023, where he was at the forefront of environmental, energy, and consumer protection issues. He was also well known, as I'm told, for his scuffed up brown wingtip shoes, following a joke that only when shining them would result when good environmental bills are passed. Those shoes are apparently have been shined about 6 times since 1978 and are now on display at the Fraser History Museum in Louisville. Fitz remains an integral part of KRC's team and is helping train the next generation of environmental attorneys and advocates. And finally, we have Anna Watts, who's a freelance photojournalist whose work examines how systemic forces shape individual lives across politics, healthcare, immigration, and labor. Their work can be found in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, and now the Margin as well. We're really grateful to have the three of you here. And so with that, let's go ahead and get started. Austyn, I just want to set the scene a little bit. Can you take us back to the beginning of the investigation when we were first in talks about what this story would look like? There are, of course, hundreds of coal-fired power plants across the country. Tell us how you learned about Mill Creek and when you realized that there was a larger story here at Valley Station.
When we started talking about this story, there was a couple things going on, like personally and in the world. So the biggest thing happening was that in April, the EPA proposed rolling back some of the regulations for coal ash, which is also known as coal combustion residuals or CCR, but we'll call it coal ash for this conversation. And so we were looking into what the rollback of coal ash regulations could mean for a community. And I was coming home to Louisville for the summer. There is a coal plant here. It's our last utility scale coal-fired power plant in Jefferson County that I always passed as a child and later as like a young adult because I attended a summer camp that was about 10 miles south of Mill Creek. So I was pretty familiar with the coal plant. I had like swum in and canoed with kids along the Ohio River, and I was always just kind of curious about the connection between Mill Creek and contamination that might be happening in the Ohio River. And so those two things kind of coincided, and I decided it would be interesting to look at Mill Creek in light of the changes going on at the EPA to just try to learn more. Like, as you said, there are hundreds of coal units across the country, and Mill Creek is sort of like a case study on a coal power plant and a coal ash site that maybe doesn't get a lot of attention, but is reflective of what's going on at a lot of plants across the country.
Absolutely. Anna, you were a part of the story from the beginning as well. I'm curious, when did you get looped in, and what was sort of attracting you to the story at the very beginning?
Yeah, I was in Kentucky because Austin and I have another project we're working on there as well. But I think so. I think for me, it was a different experience. I didn't grow up in Kentucky, but I grew up in a very rural town and a very rural place. I think what struck me about the place was just like how beautiful it is out there, in a similar way to what I'm familiar with. But then like the jarring distinction of that, and then like this coal plant kind of in the background of everything you see, both like on the river. And just like everywhere you are, you can almost always see it. And I think just like visually, it's an unbelievably striking sort of situation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the images that you captured, and we'll show some of those a little bit later, are striking. And it's hard to grasp just within the context of the story for those who haven't seen Mill Creek or the generating station before, how close the river is and the neighborhoods are to both the coal ash sites and each other. And some of the aerial shots that you provided really show that context. And so we'll share a little bit more about that later. But Tom, I'm curious if, yeah, you can answer that question with regard to how long have you been in Kentucky now, and what sort of brought you into the work that you've been doing?
So, so I was partially disconnected, which is, I guess, my ambient state. I got here in 1973, and what brought me here were two books, believe it or not. I was a New York City kid, and my older brother Rick was one of a number of Catholic college kids who was invited to come down to Kentucky to work in Eastern Kentucky on some economic development issues, working with communities through the Catholic Church. And he came home to visit one time and brought a book by a very courageous lawyer named Harry Caudle, which was a study on the exploitation of Eastern Kentucky by steel companies and coal companies and financial institutions, called Night Comes to the Cumberlands. And I'd encourage you all to read that, as well as the 50-year revisiting of that was done by Bill Estep and Lexington Herald. And then there was another book called Stripping, which was by a guy named John Stacks. It was one of the Sierra Club's early publications. So I came to Eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia to fight strip mining, and then over the time decided that I needed to go back and get some skills if I was going to continue this fight. And so I went to law school, got a degree, and worked from 80 to 84 with Applered, which is Eastern Kentucky's legal services organization, the Appalachian Research and Defense Fund of Kentucky. And I had the honor to work with one of the giants in the field, John Rosenberg, whose family suffered through the Kristallnacht during the rise of the Nazi era, and he came to the United States and became a civil rights attorney, and then became associated with Applered. So I started as a legal aid attorney, and in 1984, when Reagan administration gutted our ability to do the sort of work we were doing, I reshaped the Kentucky Resources Council to do legal aid on the environment. So that's kind of the roots of the work that we've done, and that I directed, as you mentioned, until I decided we needed a new generation of leadership. And it is the organization has a couple of great staff attorneys, has now a staff scientist, and has a wonderful director who's done really important work since taking on that function back in 2021. Ashley Wilms is her name.
Fantastic. That's super, super helpful. And it's extraordinary the work that you've done over the course of your career. And we'll definitely be leaning on you for some policy expertise this evening. But just to do a little bit more context setting, just getting us into what's happening at Mill Creek. I mean, the plant itself is a 544-acre footprint that contains enough sludge to fill 6,200 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Louisville Gas and Electric Company and the Kentucky Utilities Energy LLC, or LG&E, and KU operate Mill Creek between the banks of the Ohio River and a low-income neighborhood named Valley Station, which is less than 15 miles southwest of Louisville. And according to LG&E/KNU's own data, Mill Creek has been leaking contaminants above the federal standards into the water and into the groundwater for many, many years now. Austyn, I'm curious, just sort of like in your reporting, what did you find and what do those contaminants tell us about what's happening at the site with its coal ash?
So the reporting that I did for this story specifically is based on a 2026 report that LG&E came out with based on their 2025 sampling. This is something a utility like LG&E has to do because of the coal ash rule that was passed by the federal government in 2015. It's self-implementing, but most utilities do publish this data for the last decade, which they didn't have to do before this rule was passed. So it's really interesting data. It's very new. And basically, an early iterations of this data that were collected by Earth Justice showed that 9 out of 10 power plants across the country were contaminating groundwater at levels exceeding federal standards. So this is a well-known problem for a long time. At Mill Creek specifically, what the report and the data I looked at showed was that lithium, molybdenum, and arsenic were found at levels exceeding the federal groundwater standards at basically like 8 to 12 wells, depending on the contaminant. 17 out of 29 of the wells at Mill Creek had some contaminant that was exceeding the groundwater standard. So that doesn't mean it was happening every time over every sampling event, but there were continuous contaminants coming out. So why this matters is because it's great that a utility like LG&E is putting this information out in the public, but then there needs to be some accountability for its contamination. And why we're telling this story is because LG&E's president, he signed a letter asking the EPA to roll back some of the parts of the rule that currently exists monitoring this waste. So that's kind of like why this felt like an important connection to make.
Absolutely. I mean, just to sort of hear that it's that many times the amount of what the federal standard is just raises sort of alarm bells in my mind. But I'm curious, Tom, if you could sort of, or Fitz, if you could help sort of contextualize what exactly that means. I mean, how concerning are these findings from an environmental perspective or a regulatory perspective? What does that mean for the surrounding community and the watershed, especially with the Ohio River being right there?
To contextualize it, you're dealing with coal-fired power plants that are typically located on major waterways, right? The reason for that is because they were able to use the public's water, the rivers, to dilute their discharges rather than having to be more accountable if you cite on, say, a smaller stream or a river. So you've got along the riverbanks of many of the major rivers, you can look at a map and see you've got power plants that are utilizing the public's water for cooling, for discharging pollutants. What we're talking about with coal ash or coal combustion residuals is we're talking about what is generally captured in the pollution control equipment that used to exit the stacks and land in people's property, in people's rivers, in people's streams, in people's lakes, and now is required under the Clean Air Act of 1970 and then the amendments in 1990 to be captured and to be managed. So we take an air pollution problem and all of these metals that are associated with the coal that are then liberated during the combustion process and end up attaching themselves to the particulates, to the particles. All of that gets, or a lot of that, not all of it, gets captured and then is managed historically by sluicing it with water out of the chamber where it is combusted and then into a pond. Now, historically, these ponds have no liner. They're located near rivers in the alluvium, which is the sand and gravel that is next to the riverbanks, and readily leach contamination into the groundwater. More than 90% of the sites, and there's over 1,400 of them nationwide, where ash has been disposed of, more than 90% have been documented to have contamination. Now the question comes, if you see a power company will say, well, what we're talking about is natural. Well, yeah, that's fine. Okay, these are found in nature, right? The old adage that the dose makes the poison, there are no levels at which mercury is something that you want in your breakfast cereal and in your body, right? There's no level at which lead is therapeutic. There's no level at which radium 226 or radium 228, which are radionuclides that are liberated as part of this combustion process, is something that you want in your body. So you've got all of these metals that are in the coal that are liberated through the combustion process, that are captured on the particles, and then are dumped into these ponds or landfills and are leaching because rainfall comes in and it creates this leachate or garbage juice. It leaches. If it's slightly acidic, it's going to leach certain things. If it's more alkaline, it's going to leach other things. And they go out into the ambient environment, into the groundwater surrounding these facilities. The impact on people is going to depend on the demographics, right? In Mill Creek's case, you've got a working class neighborhood that is right next to the facility. You look at the great visuals that you all have done, you see how close Riverside, how close the Valley Station is in Valley Village to the Mill Creek plant. Other plants, you may find a greater vertical or horizontal distance between the plant and the ash ponds and anyone who might be using groundwater. And even though the groundwater in Jefferson County is no longer used for drinking purposes, that doesn't mean there's no wells in the county. And that doesn't mean that people don't use the river water, because this contamination, the Ohio River in Louisville is essentially a series of lakes that are connected through dams. And so what's upriver flows downriver. What is in the alluvium when the river level is down washes into the river. When the river level is up, it washes away from the river. So you've got this constant flow of contamination that is occurring. And the wells are identifying that. If you look where the wells are located, the gradient flows mostly to the river. So you've got up gradient and down gradient wells. Up gradient, you want to see what the background is going to be where there's no contamination, at least from this source. But it's showing that there is movement of contaminants, which is, not that surprising given the fact that these ponds were unlined. And so how to manage that and how to make it a part of the cost of using coal as a fuel is what a lot of this is all about, because the power companies historically were not held accountable. Mm-hmm. And as they became more accountable, then we get into the management issue. And who pays for that management? Is it the neighbors who pay for the lack of management? Or is it the ratepayers who are buying the electricity who are required to pay the full cost of that fuel? It was always said coal is a cheap fuel. Well, it is if you ignore the impacts on miners,
right,
the black lung, the air pollution, the groundwater pollution, and all of the other ancillary impacts that are being paid for by somebody. They're being paid in somebody's lungs, in somebody's bloodstream, in somebody's heart conditions. They're being paid by groundwater contamination. And so it's part of the legacy. And I think Austyn and Anna did an incredible service by reporting and just taking one facility as a kind of a microcosm of what is going on with all of these facilities and what's at stake when the current administration tries to roll back the clock.
Right, right. No, I really appreciate that. And I would love to pivot to you, because the images that you captured, as we talked about earlier, really do help sort of set the stage for understanding how so many of these things work together, but also really understanding the folks who live nearby the facility. As Fitz brought up, like they are really, really close. And so I'm curious if we can bring some of those images up, and then two, and if you can speak to some of the residents that you all had the chance to speak with. Austyn, I believe y'all, knocked on 60 plus doors. and spoke with dozens of residents there. And so we'd love to see those photos. And Anna, if you want to talk a little bit about some of the folks that you met while you were there.
Yeah, that sounds very great. Okay. Yeah, I think that as I mentioned before, this one neighborhood, Valley Station, is just so striking in that you can't. It's almost like impossible to walk 100 feet in any direction without seeing some view of the coal stacks emerging. And so I mean, I photographed one thing that Austyn and I learned in sort of like coming back a couple of times. I think I went back and forth like at different times of day, which is just the thing you're trying to do as a photographer, see it at, different times of day, different light, is that obviously condensation or cloudier days is going to make the steam appear way more intense. You're just going to see like billowing smoke. And then on other days when it's really sunny or bright, you'll have less of a view. But I think that like, for me, this image, because it's taken at this sort of sunset time, and you do see how beautiful it is out there, and Kentucky in the summer is stunning. It's very green. You have the Ohio River, which is super beautiful and has, greenery all along the edges. And so a sort of aerial view of sunset is, I think, in some ways like a beautiful cliche. But to see that sort of aesthetic picture with the stacks right there, and how present and close they are to the surrounding community, was like what I found to be one of the more striking examples. So you're just like, you have that contrast of just like how, beautiful and green and lush it is, and then how nearby the pollution is to everyone's lives in this town, which you're seeing like laid out in the foreground of the picture. Yeah, okay, great. And here is a picture of Gertie Hendricks, who Austyn and I spent a significant amount of time with. Austyn, was she one of the first people that you had met? Is that right? Or spoken to in your...
Yeah, excuse me, that's correct. Gertie was one of, I knocked on about 60 doors, talked to 15 to 30 people, somewhere in there. And Gertie was one of the first people who was like, really wanted to chat, was really concerned about the coal stacks, and was willing to kind of have multiple conversations. So that's how we went back together.
Yeah, so we went back to visit Gertie together. So Austyn had already met her, and she lives very, very close to the stacks, like probably she's on one of the first streets, like the nearest you can get in the neighborhood. So one of the things that I just found like really striking about visiting her is that her front yard looks out directly onto the stacks. Every single window on the front of her home reflects them. The view from her living room, you can see them. And then she's wearing glasses, and that's reflected. So it's almost like this like constant mirror of it in her life at all times. And I think she inherited the house from her mother. Is that right, Austyn?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
From her mom.
So, it has this like family legacy that's been following them. And Gertie was a sort of no to photographs at the beginning, but a sort of no in the sense of she was just kind of chatting with us for a long time. And very much credit to Austyn, who's an amazing reporter, and I've had the privilege of collaborating before, is very good at making people feel comfortable. And so we're talking to Gertie about like her garden and her home, and looking out at the stacks and many other things, like the birds bathing in her fountain. And I basically asked her if I could take this picture. This was the first picture I took of her. Can I just take a picture of the stacks reflected in your glasses? And I explained to her why, and sort of talked about this mirroring that I was seeing. And she agreed to that. And then we spent probably another hour more with her, walking around her garden, in which she is trying to sort of like grow some remedies to the pollution that she sees as entering her life. And then eventually was able to make more portraits of her. But I think that this image, just with the way she's like looking towards it, and then the reflection that you can see of the stacks in her glasses, is one of the more striking ones ultimately. And then this image, I think that when I first came into the neighborhood, and the neighborhood was new to me, I hadn't been there before, and I was just like going around to see what was visual, and Austyn had mentioned the schools. So there are, and Austyn, how many schools are there that are closed in this? We have the one main school.
Yeah, there's 2 schools that are closed. This is Watson Lane Elementary School, and then there's another school called Frost Middle that also closed and then was later purchased by LG&E.
Yeah, so I'm gonna let you then speak to why. But I think that when I probably photographed this closed school like 3 or 4 separate times on different visits. And I think that on my last visit, I went around to the back side through which you can see the stacks, and it was also one of those cloudy days. And then you end up with this, what is just a pretty insane image of what the coal stacks look like coming out over a playground, which is obviously empty. And then you can see through the bokeh, like the closed barricade, the fence, which is like signifier that the school has been closed off to the community. And this school is very much like in the center of the neighborhood. So, it just feels like this mark of what is larger happening. And I found that the residents talked a lot about like the dust and the elements of pollution that they felt like was all over all of their things. But it was very hard to visualize those things because you couldn't really see it in a photograph. But things like this really show kind of that picture of what it's doing in the neighborhood. And yeah, Austyn, you want to talk about why or like when the school, the sort of history of that is closed?
My understanding is both schools closed in the 2010s and didn't reopen. So all of the students were shifted into different schools a little further outside the neighborhood. So I think it more shows just a change in the neighborhood and sort of like how kids may have been impacted by coal power plant pollution, which is something that is featured later in the story.
Yeah.
These are extraordinary images and really do help sort of set the scene in the context. I mean, there was a couple things just in your reporting that really stuck out to me, Austyn, and some of the quotes that you heard from residents. Some referred to the plant as a quote unquote cloud maker, and others referred to kids in the neighborhood who grew up in the neighborhood as smokestacks babies. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those quotes that you heard from residents and tell us some about their families and sort of what it's like to just sort of live in the neighborhood?
Well, the neighborhood, I think, I would describe it based on, my limited experience. I want to like clarify I didn't grow up there, but based on the people I talk to, it is a place where people have lived for generations. And so they often stay and buy homes there. They often live with their parents. They often have their children there with them. Maybe their like parents live down the road from them, or their cousin lives like across the street. Like it is very much a space where families live together. But it is also a place where there's like rental homes. So there are also people who are in transition, who come there, who don't stay very long. So there's a definitely like different types of people who we were able to speak to for this story. I would say the people who seem to feel either the most worried or the least worried were people who had been there the longest. And I think people who were not worried had a lot of trust in their government. They had a lot of trust in the utility. They felt like they would be protected. Some people, I think there's some misinformation too. Some people told me the plant didn't burn coal anymore, which there are 3 coal burning stacks there still. So we definitely got a wide array of responses, but I would say a lot of people who lived there for a long time had serious concerns about impacts to their health that could be connected to living so close to the coal plant. But I think one of the problems that the story tries to highlight is there's very little information for people about directly connecting their illnesses to exposure to coal air emissions or coal ash pollution. And that is something that I think people in that community have reckoned with for a long time. It is also the location of one of the only federally funded health studies that exist on the impacts of coal ash pollution. And that was a study done on about 280 children aged 6 to 14 over about roughly 10 years. And that study showed that kids could have neurobehavioral problems, depression, lower ability in school, and that they also had heavy metals in their toenails. But again, that it was like a very not a preliminary study, but a study that could use a lot more research in order to make more direct connections, and the funding just isn't there. So I think one of the things we really wanted to show in the story is like, yes, people have concerns, but there's not a lot of research available that can back up those concerns for them to say like their doctor.
Yeah. Austin, I'm curious if you can go a little bit deeper into that study just to talk about sort of how that study was conducted. I mean, my understanding is that we don't really get very many studies like these, and I think there's a plethora of reasons as to why. One of them being like, who is going to fund a study like that? But it's also really difficult to sort of embed yourself in the lives of folks who are willing to give something as intimate as toenails. I mean, just like how does that such a study work? How did that come to be, and why haven't we seen further studies since?
Well, I'd be curious if Fitz has anything to add to this too, like if there are other studies that we should be highlighting in this conversation. But for this study in particular, it was started by a researcher who was then at the University of Louisville named Christina Zierold. She had basically been coming to the community between 2010 and 2012, because at the time, which I'm sure Fitz is much more aware of than me, there was a lot of conversation about coal ash pollution, and there was a lot of like concerned citizens who were beginning to speak up about their worries at Mill Creek, but also at another coal plant called Cane Run, which has since closed in terms of its coal stacks. It still burns gas. But basically, Christina Zierold started to get to know the community. She brought out graduate student researchers. They eventually connected with 280 kids, so probably roughly 250 to 280 families. And basically through what Christina called shoe leather epidemiology, gain the trust of all these people. But it took years to gain that level of trust. It took a lot of door knocking. It took a lot of research, a lot of outreach. It's extremely time consuming. She got a $3 million grant with her co-researchers to do this work. She's tried to get more funding since, especially to study the cancer in adults that has also been connected to coal ash exposure, but she's been unable to get that funding so far. I think one other thing I would highlight in this conversation is that one of the reasons we even have a coal ash rule now is because there has been coal ash disasters in the past. There was a particular one in 2008 in East Tennessee called the Kingston coal ash disaster, where a bunch of coal ash broke free from a dam, really impacted a community. But it's kind of what happened afterwards that is more interesting in terms of this conversation, because there was a 7-year cleanup. A bunch of workers alleged that they became very sick from that cleanup and eventually had a lawsuit against the contractor responsible for that cleanup. That was what Christina Zierold, the researcher we're speaking about here, would sort of call like a missed opportunity. That was like a time where you could have had a very specific workplace exposure study, and that was never done. So we've had opportunities to have more studies in the past, but they've never really come to fruition.
No, I mean, just to take years to be able to get into folks' homes and sort of establish that trust and then to conduct a study like that is really time consuming. And so it's extraordinary. And I think it also underscores just sort of what you and Anna heard knocking on folks' doors, just the level of misinformation there is, the different levels of concern, even folks who've been there for a long time. I mean, you'd started the conversation by saying that there have been federal rollbacks, and that's sort of what led to you wanting to do this story. Fitz, I'm curious if you can jump in here with these federal rollbacks that we're seeing from the White House and the EPA. What does that mean for folks who basically are left to fend for themselves? Like, what does that necessarily look like, especially when there aren't any sort of watchdogs at the state level or now at the federal level that are looking out for folks?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. Following up on what Austyn mentioned, it is extremely difficult to identify and create the causal link between an exposure and a resulting injury. It's difficult because you don't have the historical data, and Austyn's absolutely right that it would have been one of those times where you could have gathered that data. You know, we with a couple of notable and horrific exceptions. We don't intentionally uh, uh, experiment on people in terms of exposure. But in reality, when we separated EPA and environmental regulation from the public health model, we're experimenting on all of us, right? Because what we should be talking about is the precautionary principle of first do no harm, but instead we have the industry saying we shouldn't have to be accountable for our waste unless you can demonstrate that the harm has occurred. And it is difficult to create that link because we don't intentionally experiment on people, and because you have confounding influences, what you breathe, whether there's a smoker, whether there's the car exhaust, other pollution sources. For example, southwest Jefferson County, where Mill Creek is located, you also have a Portland cement plant, and you have a former hazardous waste facility that had an emission stack, and you have Rubbertown, which is a number of synthetic organic chemical manufacturers. And so you have this cumulative burden that people are carrying in addition to other risks that they may be exposed to. So it's very difficult to build a legally defensible case, even though anecdotally we know that the stuff that is now being captured and being managed as fly ash used to be what people were breathing when they lived for 2 or 3 generations in Valley Village and Valley Station. A lot of the folks in the area originally were from Fort Knox. And these are people who had served our country, their families who moved off the fort, off the base, and settled in Jefferson County and Bullitt County, and as they had families. And it's frustrating because there is within most communities, certainly within Jefferson County, a tolerance for levels of exposure to pollution related to the economic and sometimes racial status of folks that would never be tolerated in other areas of the county. And so it's extremely frustrating. And this is part of the burden that Valley Village, Valley Station, and Shively in this area has borne over the years, level of tolerating pollution and the public, the use of the public's air, land, and water by private companies as a way of disposing of their waste. As far as the rollbacks, the 2015 federal rules on coal combustion wastes were the first time that nationally there were federal rules that compelled the states and compelled the utilities to a certain level of accountability for their wastes. Now they had to put in groundwater monitoring wells. They had to close these unlined ash ponds that were in communication with groundwater, or because most of them are sitting right on the alluvium and the groundwater level is not very deep, and it's not confined groundwater that's inside a rock. It's groundwater that's moving through sand and gravel layers in many cases that is directly capable of being contaminated. They had to close the leaking landfills and close the leaking ponds, and they had to disclose all of this to the public on their websites. What was left on the table in 2015 was about half the problem, which is the older sites that had been closed before the rule became effective. And those were closed by the utilities in some cases, knowing that the rules were coming, and they were closed to avoid having to be accountable for them. They weren't closed by removing this stuff and putting it someplace secure. They were closed by capping over the unlined waste piles and landfills that are still in communication with groundwater. So the legacy coal ash protections that were put in place in 2024 extended those protections. And they basically said, utilities, you have to identify every place historically on your property that you used to manage as coal ash. Then you need to figure out if they're leaking, and you need to address them. That is what primarily the Trump rule is attempting to undo, which is responsibility for the closed sites that are about half the problem. And they're also weakening the current levels of accountability. For example, if I have a well historically under the rule, I'm supposed to put my well at the waste boundary so that I can determine if there's stuff migrating through the soil or through the subsoil or through the groundwater off-site. Now they're allowing them to move the wells further away, which means you get to contaminate that much more area before it is even detected. And so you get to contaminate not only the waste site, but the surrounding area. And it's harder to detect as you go further out because your scope is you need to put more wells in the further you go from a site because you've got more area to cover. So things like that are designed not with science in mind, not with public health in mind, but with giving the utilities and the coal industry indirectly a break at the cost of the people who live closest to the facilities. Because these costs don't go away just because you don't make somebody accountable for them. Somebody's paying that cost off budget. And the folks who pay it off budget are downhill and downwind and downstream. And I frankly think it's immoral to be doing that. And I think there's a lot of folks, those who have borne the brunt of this so-called cheap energy source would probably feel the same way. And it sounds like from what Austyn and Anna discovered they do. There's frustration and there's a certain degree of cynicism that's understandable. How could the government allow this to happen? And so it's frustrating to see the Trump administration. It's a wrong-headed economically as well as environmentally and on a public health basis because you're not going to create a new market and a new renaissance for the coal industry by weakening environmental controls.
Right.
Because the economic forces that are affecting the industry are much greater than that. The hydrofracking and horizontal drilling, opening up the Utica and the Marcellus Shale and the shale formations in the West fundamentally changed the economics of power generation, as did the emergence of battery storage for renewables, which dealt with the intermittency issue there. That clock is not going to be turned back. The question is how much damage is going to be done and how much backsliding is going to be done before we have some accountability. And I think, fortunately, we have folks like Austyn, we have folks like Anna, we have folks like you and the work that you're doing, Bryce, that are shining the light on what has been going on, because it is absolutely should not be tolerated that some folks are paying dearly for everyone else's profligate use of electricity.
Thanks so much, Fitz. I mean, you raised so many good points. And if folks haven't read the story yet, in addition to the incredible reporting from Austyn and the photos from Anna, there's some really extraordinary visualizations that show just sort of the relative proximity of the generating station to the neighborhoods and shows the contamination levels that have increased. We also have a map that shows the cancer rates or the cancer instances per 100,000 people across the entire United States, in which case you see Kentucky sadly light up just in red. There's only a few counties that are not in full red, and many other counties along the Mississippi River and in the Appalachian Mountains, including West Virginia, are also very red. And then you'd also raise just that these stations are located in places that have lower economics and higher amounts of folks who are higher populations of color as well. And we published a map that shows that, in addition to data centers that are also located in similar spaces. And so pivoting the conversation a little bit, you mentioned that industry often refers to coal as quote unquote cheap energy, but there are so many other costs that go unaccounted for. And even now we see that there are cheaper forms of energy that ought to be used. And yet, Austyn, what behooves me is that these stations and these stacks are staying on even longer and longer, and that Kentucky projects that its energy demand will double in the coming years, partially due to the data center demand. Can you talk us through kind of like those discrepancies and these tensions that seem to be pulling at one another and just largely don't seem to make sense to the average person, including myself?
Yeah, so LG&E, the utility, has projected that its energy demand will double in the coming years, largely due to data centers. There's a lot of activism right now around one that it would be located. It's about a 400 megawatt data center. It would be located in Louisville, just north of the Mill Creek Station. So that is a lot of tension around that right now. But as we all know, AI data centers are exploding across the country. They have a huge demand for energy. The most recent, I think it was a Bloomberg report I saw, said there could be a spike of 20%. And a lot of that, we don't know yet how much energy these data centers will demand. We don't know how many will be built. But it is a projection. That means we're building out a lot more fossil fuels than we otherwise might. We're building out right now a lot of gas plants, but we're also arguing at the federal level. Trump, right before we published this story, announced $700 million to keep coal power plants alive, including $124 million to 3 Kentucky coal plants. So there is a lot of effort right now to keep coal burning in the state of Kentucky. Our legislature has also tried multiple times, which Fitz knows better than me again, passing laws postponing, basically making it more difficult to retire coal plants and to replace it with renewable energy. So Kentucky is a particularly hard state when it comes to the transition, although there's lots of people doing the work to make it happen. But it is particularly slow here and difficult, and Mill Creek is sort of like an example of that right now, especially when it comes to its relationship to data centers.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. And Fitz, I'm curious if you can jump in here as well. I mean, have you seen over the course of your career something that has sort of enabled sort of what ought to be a dying source of energy sort of staying on longer and demand to sort of increase at this rate? And we have seen across the country that people are pushing back against data centers being located in their communities and backyards, and yet many of them are still moving forward in very oftentimes secretive ways. Are there any other things that you're seeing across the state that can sort of help us unpack this?
Well, I think that Austyn pointed to a couple of very important kind of themes. The within the past couple of years, the General Assembly has twice enacted, first enacting a law and then modifications to it that have made it more difficult, as she noted, to retire coal-fired capacity and make it impossible to replace it with most renewables. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to utilize those coal plants. You are dispatching your least cost power and your cleanest power. So you're going to keep these plants around. The ratepayers are going to pay for the privilege of having plants that are uneconomic to use, maintained rather than closed and mothballed the way they should be, because you're interfering with the historic goal of utilities, which was least cost power, right? Now that the least cost power is renewables, a lot of the industry doesn't want to talk about least cost power. They want to talk about protecting coal. They want to talk about protecting something else. The levelized cost of energy favors renewables backed by battery storage. It doesn't favor coal-fired capacity. And even with this new demand, there's this fundamental disconnect between this burgeoning demand for data centers and the capacity to ramp up production, right? Nobody's building new coal-fired power plants in the United States, right? Nobody's investing in it. You're not going to find the private sector willing to put their money into it, even if the federal government under this administration is willing to throw money at coal plants or is willing to order that plants that should be closed stay open under the guise of needing them for reliability, even though the utilities don't agree. But they're having to maintain them, and there's a cost being paid by ratepayers because of these policy decisions coming out of Washington. The data centers are the new shiny thing. And so you've got a bunch of real estate developers out there who are converting land to try to create a demand, kind of their field of dreams that they want to build. If we build it, we get the zoning and we get the everything in place, they will come, right? You've got some companies that are doing hyperscale data centers, but you've got a lot more speculation going on. And when you actually require people to put up money, private money, you're finding that there's a lot less demand than there was initially projected. The problem, the concern that I have, and this is, as somebody who advocates on behalf, who kind of lives in that intersection between poverty and environmental justice and environmental pollution, because we don't charge for what we do and we don't represent folks who could afford representation, is you're seeing a whole lot of speculative construction of new generation capacity. And we are trying. The attorneys that we work with, Earth is doing amazing work. The Resources Council, our staff attorney, Byron Gary, is doing amazing work, trying to make sure that the ratepayers don't get stuck with the costs for a new generation that's being built to address the speculative demand for data centers. So, because I think what you're going to see is they're delaying some retirements, they're building new gas capacity, they're going to overbuild that capacity. And then the question is, who gets stuck with the bill for the over construction? Because you've got this new generation of quantum computing coming on that has a very different energy profile than what your traditional data centers are requiring. And so it's a time of great, ferment in terms of what's going on, and there's a lot of uncertainty within the markets. And we're just trying to make sure that the public, both in terms of their health and in terms of their pocketbook, don't end up being the ones who are paying the bill for this speculation.
Thanks for that. There's so much uncertainty around just sort of this expansion, and I think where we can find clarity is always helpful. I know we're approaching the end of the hour here, and so if folks don't have any questions who are in the audience, would love to go around the horn here, beginning with Anna. Based on conversations that you've had with residents, based on the interviews that you've done over the course of this reporting, and Fitz, based on your expertise, if everyone can sort of answer and think about, like, what does true accountability look like in this case?
You want
to start with Anna and
Let's
go
start with
around?
Anna. Yeah.
Well, I think I'll answer your question in a different way first. I think that this kind of reporting is really interesting to work on, because instead of addressing something right when a disaster has occurred, or like when some major news is like driving you to the site. And I think that this was like very present in like when Austyn and I were going to visit people. You just have a very different experience working with people that just deal with something literally on a day-to-day basis. Like, it is just part of their constant reality. I think for that reason, like, a lot of people didn't want to be photographed. Like, you had to knock on a tremendous amount of doors. And then you have like various different concerns or wanting to be part of something. But I think that just like in the journalism world, that is that kind of accountability to looking at stories that are just sort of under the radar, constant, in light of like larger policy that happens, is just very powerful. So that would be in terms of like accountability, I'm gonna let Austyn and Fitz handle that one, because I think that they're much more able to get there.
Yeah, I can answer that quickly. I mean, I think accountability looks like just keeping science and regulations and in journalism. There's so much science about coal ash research. Even though, as Fitz mentioned, it's like extremely hard to connect any illness to any exposure, regardless of whether it's coal ash or something else. But there's so much science showing us that coal ash contains contaminants that can be harmful to human health. And I just think keeping that central in how we regulate and legislate this waste material and protect communities from it is very important. Under the Biden administration, before the Trump EPA came into office, it was a national priority to protect communities from coal ash. And that's changed since. But I think just trying to recenter it on community safety is where accountability can lie.
So it's a really good question, and I think that accountability is is created when people show up, and people keep showing up. You know, there was a guy named Danny Lyon who was part of the civil rights movement in the 60s, early 60s, who was a photographer. And when I looked at Anna's work, it reminded me of Danny's work, photographing the Freedom Riders, photographing the sit-ins at the restaurants and the abuse that they suffered to try to desegregate the counters in Nashville and in other southern towns. And so accountability is created with the sort of reportage that Austyn did and the sort of communicating of that reportage that you do, Bryce. I think that, accountability, what it would look like, it would look like what Bob Bullard, Professor Bullard, outlined as the environmental justice principles, right? The precautionary principle, first do no harm. You don't have we don't have to demonstrate why pollution is bad. You, polluter, demonstrate why it is that you should be able to use the public's air, land, and water for waste disposal, or you find a way to manage it that doesn't shift your costs of doing business to other people. Informed consent, you know, a protection rather than control after the fact of 30 and 40 and 50 years of pollution. So we have other models. The public health model that unfortunately in the 70s was divorced from environmental protection that says informed consent, even for therapeutic intrusion into people's lives, let alone pollution. But when I think about accountability, I think about this sort of reportage. I think about the photographic work that Anna does. I think about folks like John Lewis, the late congressman, right? The day belongs to those who show up and who keep showing up. And so I encourage those who are viewing, right? Get on the horn. Talk to your folks in Congress. Talk to your state legislators. Talk to your neighbors. Get knowledgeable. There's some great work out there that's being done by Earth Justice, by the Environmental Integrity Project, by the Union of Concerned Scientists, by others. Get informed and get noisy, right? Be creatively intolerant of this sort of behavior, and then that behavior will change over time. And recognize it doesn't happen overnight. But Dr. King was right when he said the moral arc of the universe is bending towards justice, and all of us in our own way have the ability to help bend it a little fast and a little faster, a little further.
Thank you so much for that. That's a fantastic place to end. Austyn and Anna, thank you so much for your reporting. Thank you so much for doing it with us. We're really grateful and hope to work together again very, very soon. And Fitz, such a pleasure meeting you this evening. And thank you for all your contributions over the course of your career and certainly here this evening as well. And to the audience, I'm so glad that you are able to join us today. Please tell folks about what you heard. Subscribe to The Margin, and we are super, super grateful. And there will be many more stories to come. With that, we'll bid everyone adieu. Have a good evening.